Welcome in, YouTube family. I am Kelly R. Jackson, and this is a moment with the author. Again, we introduced this segment in our last video, and what we're doing is we're going to do a moment with the author, myself, Kelly R. Jackson. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a YouTube clip, a video clip, discussing the motivation, the inspiration behind each of the 10 books that I've published. And we did our last one on the very first book that we published, Temporarily Disconnected. So this one, we're moving on to book number 2. Book number 2 that I published was a book of poetry that I did way back in 2007. So as of right now, this book is about 10 and a half years old. Book called Scenes from the Blue Book, Poetry, Reflection, and the Spoken Mind. This is the cover of the book, very plain. Again, Scenes from the Blue Book, Poetry, Reflection, and the Spoken Mind. Again, did this back in 2007. This was my second book that I did. And so what we're going to be doing is going to be talking about what went into the book, some of the inspiration, motivation behind this. Now, as we did in the last video, I written down 4 questions that I'm going to answer in relation to this particular book. So the first question that I have written down here is, how long have you been writing poetry? How long have you been writing poetry? Interesting enough, I've been writing poetry longer than I've been writing anything else. And I've been writing, my writing career, if you will, I've been writing for over 30 years of my life. And so I've been writing poetry since I was in high school. And so there's an interesting story behind my very first poem. The very first poem that I wrote, I probably still have it somewhere. Very first poem that I wrote about a girl in high school. And I was literally sitting behind her in high school. I had a crush on this young lady. I cannot remember her name right now to save my life, but I sat behind her in class, literally one desk behind her back, and I was literally writing a poem about her, and I had a crush on her. And I never spoke to her. She never saw the poem. Back then, you know, as a teenager, I was shy, so I was very shy about approaching girls. And I know that seems crazy right now because here I am doing a YouTube video talking about how shy I was, but I was shy when I was younger, and I was not brave when it came down to approaching girls. So I just wrote that poem about this young lady and kept it to myself. Strangely enough, I can't remember her name, but she inspired my writing career, and I've been writing ever since. So that was the very first poem that I wrote. So I've been writing poetry for over 30 years. Like I said, I started writing in high school, and it was something that I just tried doing. I was always good with words, and it really did come naturally to me. And so now, anytime somebody needs a poem for something, you know, and I hope this doesn't get around too much where people start asking for it again. But I do have to sit down, I have to put poetry together for certain things. And so that's how long I've been writing poetry. I've been writing for over 30 years. I know a lot of the work that I do now, which is ministry related, you wouldn't see poet in there. But that was the first thing that I really started to do. Was I really started as a poet. So I really started writing poetry. Now, second question I have written down here is, what made you publish this book of poetry? What made you publish this particular book of poetry? Well, interesting story. As I said, I was writing in high school, and once I wrote that first poem, I realized that I was good at putting those words together. I realized that I was good at writing poetry. And so I started writing more poems. And I had this big black notebook that I used to keep all of my poems in. I kept it in my room. It wasn't necessarily under lock and key because I was never shy about the fact that I wrote poetry. I was just shy about approaching girls with the poems. But I had this big black notebook that every time I write a poem, I'd write them out real neat. My handwriting was great. And I would put them in this notebook. And my mother said she was in my room, and she said she was cleaning. I said she was snooping because I was a teenage boy. Cleaning my room was more than a notion, if you will. That room was a mess. So I was usually ordered to clean the room, but I say my mother was just snooping. But anyway, I kept them in this big black notebook, and my mom, in the process of her cleaning, her rummaging, her snooping, or whatever it is that she was doing, she opened up the book and she started to see that I was writing poetry. And so she said to me then, even as a teenage boy, she said, "You ought to publish this. You ought to get these published." And you know, I'm thinking, okay, well, that's just a mom. She's proud. I didn't really give it any serious thought because, as far as I was concerned, at that point in my life, I wasn't planning on being a writer. I was still in high school. I was still chasing girls, to be honest. So, listen, I was thinking about being a poet, but she found this black notebook, and interesting enough, and let me share this point very quickly. They were all kept in a black notebook. Eventually, they started to be kept in a blue notebook, and that's why the title of the book is Scenes from the Blue Book, because, again, as I got older and I got confident with women, I would share poems with women, and they moved to a bigger notebook. It was a bigger notebook, and it just happened to be blue. And so anytime I would have female company, they would say, I want to read something out of the blue book, because whenever I would write a new poem, I would put it in the book. And so that's where the title came from, Scenes from the Blue Book, because they always stayed in a blue notebook. And even after that, it seems like every book where the poems were kept, the notebook was blue. And so there are Scenes from the Blue Book. But so what made me publish the book? My mom made me publish the book. I promised my mother when I started writing my first book, Temporarily Disconnected, I made a promise to Mom, and she said, what about the poems? When she found out I was writing the first book, I said, Mom, if you let me finish this first book, I promise you I'll do a book of poetry. And so here it is. I did the book of poetry for my mother. I dedicated it to my mother, and that's what made me write the book. Mama made me write the book. I'm glad she made me write it. I'm glad I did it. And you won't be able to tell that after I answer this next question, but that is the reason that I did the book, because my mom wanted me to do the book. So let's get to question number 3. Question number 3, why did it almost not happen? Why did Scenes from the Blue Book almost not happen? I've told the story to some other people before. I'm going to share it with you. There was a lot of personal things that I put in Temporarily Disconnected in the first edition. The 5th chapter of that first edition is not in the revised edition because I just didn't feel like it was pertinent to that book. But anyway, I thought that might be the most personal thing that I'd ever write in a book. And I was still self-publishing. I self-published all of my work. But back then I was working with a different company, self-publishing my books. And I would have to send them the files so that they would publish the book. Well, I gave myself a deadline. I said, you got to have this book uploaded to the company by this date. Just to give myself a deadline to hold myself accountable. The night before I was to upload my files, I had all of the hard copies to the poem laying on the floor of my apartment. And I was trying to put them in the order so I know how to order the files that I put in there. And I looked at the floor, and I looked at all of those poems on the floor. I said to myself, man, your heart, your soul, your emotions, your heartbreak, your everything is laying right here on the floor in front of you. There's some very real and personal stuff in these poems, because anytime that people write poetry, those of you that might be watching that are poets, when you write poetry, you write from here. And so everything, just about everything that had happened to me in my romantic life, in a lot of ways, all of the pain, the heartache, and the struggles were laying on the floor in front of me. Now, every poem in this book, it's not about me. It doesn't have anything to do with me. Some poems are just written just from my creativity. Some poems are written from other people's experiences, things that people have said to me, and I turned it into a poem. But some of this stuff is about me, and it's all about me. And I said to myself, do you really want to bare your soul to all of these people that are close to you in this manner? I almost did not publish this book out of fear. To my knowledge, I've never had an anxiety attack, but that night, I believe there might have been one, because I looked at all of those poems and I looked at all that raw emotion, and I just said, I'm afraid to put this out there. But I went back and I said, you got to do it for the art of it. I'm proud of my poetry, and I said, this is good poetry, and people have always enjoyed your poems. You got to do it for the sake of the art. And you got to do it because you promised your mama you would do it. And you certainly can't pull the plug the night before when she already is expecting this book to be published. And so it was a hard book to publish. This was the hardest book, strange enough, the hardest book I've ever had to publish, because there's so much personal stuff in there. And even now when I go back and I look and I read it, I go back to that place that I was, and I say, my goodness. So this is why this book almost did not happen. It was fear. I didn't want to let people in, but for the sake of the art and for the sake of the doing it so that somebody else might be able to benefit from it and enjoy it, I went ahead and did it, and I'm actually glad that I did do it because I did enjoy the book, and a lot of people enjoyed the book. Last question here, and then we're done. Will you ever do another book of poetry? Will you ever do another poetry book? And interesting enough, when I did Scenes from the Blue Book, my writing career, as I've said before in these videos, I'm 10 books in now. I had planned to only write 2 books. I planned to write Temporarily Disconnected, and I planned to do this one for my mama. And I was supposed to be done after that. But people received the first 2 books so well, especially this poetry book, that I had actually started gathering poems for the next poetry book. So there's a lot more poems that I've written that never made it to this book. And I started gathering poems for the next book. And so I was preparing to write it, but then God shifted some things, and we're going to talk about that in our next video for our next book. But God shifted some things, and I went away from poetry. And after that, I was only writing poetry for my girlfriend, who became my fiance, became my wife, Angela. There came a point where I was only writing poems for Angela. And so I've got enough poems that I've written for Angela to still kind of get that thing going. Will I, to answer the question, will I do another poetry book? I cannot say whether or not I will do another poetry book. I am not sure. I don't know what God has in store. I'm capable. I'm able. I still believe that I write poetry well enough to do another poetry book. But to do a poetry book, to do a book of poetry, in my opinion, your heart's got to be in it. Your heart has got to be in this. And so I want to make sure that if I ever do another book of poetry, that my heart is in it. And that it really is what I want to do, and that I'm not trying to make money, or I'm not trying to do it because people think I should be doing it. And so there you have it. Scenes from the Blue Book, Poetry Reflection in the Spoken Mind, the book my mama made me write. And you know what was so interesting? Let me share this before we get out of here. Is that I would always write poems, not just for females, but I would always write poems for my mother. Anytime that there was a birthday, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, any special occasions, rather than go to the store and buy a Hallmark card, I figure, why give my money to Hallmark when I have the ability to go upstairs and write down how I feel? And my mother, being the woman that she is, she was so proud. She would take my poems and she would sit them on the table right there with everybody else's card and make me feel some kind of special, even though I was trying to make her feel special. But she always believed in the poetry. She always pushed me to do it. She always encouraged me. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of that back to her. And so Scenes from the Blue Book, Poetry Reflection and the Spoken Mind. Let me say this before we wrap this up. The spoken mind, when you see that part in the title, there are pieces that I wrote in here that are not poetic. They're not poetry, but they were thoughts and they were feelings that I had, and I've always been one to speak my mind. And so that's why I called it the spoken mind, because there were things that I wanted to say that weren't necessarily poetic, but I felt like sharing, kind of in the vein of male-female relationships, some other things. One of the pieces that I wrote in this book is called Love's Eulogy. I just saw it as I was flipping through the pages here. That's one of my favorite pieces. I'm going to read it once I'm done making this video. Love's Eulogy. I wrote a piece called There's Nothing Like Family. Other pieces that I wrote that weren't necessarily poems, but I felt like they would be good in this collection. And so I shared that, and so that's where the spoken mind aspect of this book comes from. But I am proud of this book, Scenes from the Blue Book. I'm proud that I've written it. And I believe that if you purchase it, you would enjoy it. Now, this book in particular, you can go to my website and order it, krjministries.org. You can also find it on Amazon.com. So we encourage you, if you're into poetry, if you like that kind of thing, go ahead and pick up a copy. It's almost 11 years old, but I believe that you'll still enjoy it. I believe some of it is definitely stood up to the test of time. Listen, that's all for this segment of A Moment with the Author. We thank you all for tuning in. We thank you all for watching. Again, if you like this video, go ahead and click the like button. Share it on social media. If you're not a subscriber to our channel, go ahead and subscribe to us. We're going to share, we got 8 more of these to do, and we're going to be sharing a lot more on the YouTube channel in this year of 2018. So thank you all for taking the time again Don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to share it. If you got some comments, leave your comments. If you bought a copy of this book and you're a friend of mine and you want to talk about what your favorite poem is, go ahead and put it in the comments section. We would love to hear back from you all. Listen, we want you to stay tuned. We're going to be back with our third book that I wrote, Peace in My Mind. And there is a story behind that book that I cannot wait to share. I'm going to try not to make that video 20 minutes long because there's a story behind that book that connects me to ministry. That I don't want to get into that right now. So listen, we pray that you all enjoyed this video. Again, don't forget to like it. Don't forget to share it. Don't forget to subscribe. Come back next time and join us on A Moment with the Author. Thank you all for stopping by. God bless you.